15.
Thank you very much. So I was really lucky to be on the, editorial board of Mosaic when it launched a couple of years ago. And of course, the USP of Mosaic is to provide long-form, compelling narrative stories. So what I want to do tonight is to give you a narrative about narratives. And what I mean is narrative is, in the most general sense, a kind of just a thread that links events. And I want to explore in several different ways that human propensity to see patterns. Now, this is a classic experiment run by psychologists who've been obviously fascinated by the human predilection for narrative. It was done in 1944 by Fritz Heider and Mary Ann Simmel, and people were shown this animation of the triangles and the circle moving around a square, and then they were asked to explain what they'd seen. And they talked about the circle and the little triangle being in love, and the big bad grey triangle. I mean, there were variants on this thing, trying to steal away the circle, and the blue triangle fighting back and trying to get the little triangle back, and so on and so forth, or yelling to his love to escape, and how they embraced and lived happily. You look at it, you think, well, hang on, it's a pretty kind of basic animation here. And it sort of shows you that there really is a propensity for us to build stories about things that we've seen. And since then, there's been some brain scan studies by Chris and Uta Frith and Frankie Happy. And here you can see the activation patterns in the brain. And what you find is remarkable is that the very same brain network is engaged whether we're considering moving shapes or the mental states of others. So you can imagine there's lots of machinery in our heads to spot patterns, to detect faces, to discern emotions, and in particular to look at those patterns linked with survival, our ability to pass on genes. Now, we're constructing stories the whole time out of whatever we see, and this is obviously really important in science in a kind of really pure form, as to try to explain the world in narratives that we call theory, mathematical narratives. But it also is the foundation of superstition, because when we get coincidences, we can read patterns into them that could see agency in dark shadows or messages in the stars and so on. And so for Mosaic, I was writing a story about how one set of brains was trying to interpret patterns in another set of brains. And they were investigating a really hard problem, how to detect signs of consciousness in those very unfortunate people who are in a vegetative state. And these are people who, roughly speaking, are awake and yet unaware. So this is Adrian Owen, who's now at Western University in Canada, and I first came across Adrian when he worked for the Medical Research Council's Cognition and Brain Sciences unit in Cambridge. And in 1997, a close friend of Adrian's had a terrible accident from which she never regained consciousness. And that got him wondering back then, was there a way to determine whether she was in an unconscious coma, or whether there were glimmers of consciousness left, or whether she was just somewhere in between. And at that time, there were lots of reports about the use of brain scanning technologies, fMRI and PET and so on. And he wondered, was there a way to use these technologies to reach out to patients like his friend who were kind of stuck between sensibility and oblivion? But of course, it's tricky, because as those 1944 experiments showed us, we can see evidence of agency and consciousness even when there's none. So there's lots of traps to negotiate there. So this is Kate Bainbridge, who really provided one of the keys to show that Adrian was onto something. And, by following this story, and I covered it for the Telegraph, I think in the 90s and then, in the noughties and so on, what I found again and again was that these stories about connecting with another person were really unlike any other stories that I'd heard before. So this is Kate before her accident. She's a 26-year-old school teacher. In 97, lapsed into a coma after she came down with a flu-like illness, and she was left in a vegetative state. And Adrian investigated, and his results, which were published in 98, were extraordinary, because he found evidence that Kate was reacting to faces, according to the brain scanner, in just the same way as healthy volunteers. And if you looked at the brain scans, you found that there was a splash of red marking brain activity at the back of her head in the fusiform gyrus, which is the part of the brain that helps us recognize faces. And so Kate really became the first patient in whom sophisticated brain imaging, and this is a PET scan, it's not so sophisticated today, revealed what we call covert cognition. Now, what's even more extraordinary about Kate's story is that she actually surfaced from her ordeal 6 months after the initial diagnosis. And she could recall what it felt like. So she said, they said I could not feel pain. They were so wrong. You know, she would cry out, but the nurses thought it was a reflex. She even tried to kill herself by holding her breath, but of course she couldn't hold her nose, so that didn't work. And she described the sensation of what she called a gradual awakening. It took her about 5 months to learn how to smile again. And by the time she sort of came back, she was still in a very debilitated state. She'd lost her job, her sense of smell and taste, and really much of what had been a normal future. She's still angry about the way that she was treated when she was at her most vulnerable, but she's very grateful to those who helped her mind to escape. So here's a note she wrote to Adrian, and obviously, you know, incredibly touching. I was unresponsive and looked hopeless, but the scan showed people I was in there. So she really showed that Adrian was onto something. Now, here's a story that I wrote on the 8th of September 2006. This time, Adrian had teamed up with Stephen Lorries at the Coma Science Group at the University of Liège, and Stephen was very kindly helped me visit his department and talk to all of his team. Another tragedy is a 23-year-old woman. In July 2005, she crossed a road. She was chatting on her mobile, struck by 2 cars. So she was diagnosed as vegetative, sort of awake but not aware. But there was something about her that led one of Adrian's colleagues to refer her to Adrian. And earlier work had shown that when you imagine playing tennis, you activate part of the cortex, the rind of the brain, called the supplementary motor area. And if you imagine walking around the house, you activate quite a different area or series of other areas in the brain. And you can imagine these patterns of activity are as distinct as a yes or a no. So when he was studying her supposedly vegetative brain with a scanner, he asked her to imagine the same things. And what was stunning was that he saw the same activation patterns as healthy volunteers. So he could read her mind. But clearly, you know, had they seen a pattern that was consistent with consciousness? So there's a kind of backstory to this. I seem to have gone one head. Okay, let me, I'm going ahead of myself here. But, I mean, clearly at the time there were, like any good narrative, there were antagonists who provided kind of dramatic tension. Doctors thought they knew the answers. No patient in a persistent vegetative state was conscious. You know, don't confuse us with the fact the brain lights up when you show these patients an image. You can dope a monkey. You can sedate a monkey and exactly the same thing will happen. And of course, at that time, doctors thought it was perfectly acceptable to end the lives of these patients by withdrawing water, withdrawing food, and they still do. Now, skeptics argued that it was completely wrong to make radical inferences from these brain scans. So one of them suggested that brain activity was unconsciously triggered by the last word of the instructions, which always referred to the sort of things that Adrian was asking them to imagine. Another talked about errors of inference. You can imagine a conscious brain, when thinking about tennis, it's triggering a certain pattern of activation, but that pattern of activation doesn't necessarily signify consciousness. So there was quite a lot of pushback from the establishment. And you can imagine there's another thing going on there, that it's troubling to think that patients that you've declared vegetative have an inner life. You know, what do you tell the relatives? You know, are they in pain? All the rest of it. It raises all sorts of uncomfortable questions. And of course, there's a backstory to this, which I've sort of summed up with this slide here, which is a story of unintended consequences. Because patients only really started to survive terrible brain injuries in the wake of the rise of artificial respiration and intensive care. And, you know, half a century ago, these patients just didn't survive. Once we developed these techniques, obviously a revolution for intensive medicine, but it meant that we ended up with a lot of patients who were written off as vegetables or jellyfish by the medical establishment. Now, in Europe alone, there's something like 230,000 coma cases a year, and about 30,000 will languish in what's called a persistent vegetative state. There's another story here about how we categorize consciousness. We've got here Fred Plum from New York and Brian Jennett from Glasgow, who in the 60s really did the work to sort of show that consciousness is not a binary on-off thing. It comes in many shades of grey. Plum coined the term locked-in syndrome. That's when a patient is aware and fully conscious but just cannot move. With Plum, Jennett devised the Glasgow coma scale, and that gave you a sense of the depth of coma. In 2002, Jennett came up with the phrase minimally conscious. And that's for people who are sometimes awake and partly aware, who show kind of erratic signs of consciousness. They both came up with persistent vegetative state for those patients who have periods of wakefulness when their eyes are open and move, but they never speak. But what we found from studies in Belgium, UK, USA, and Canada is that something like 20 to 40% of those patients in a supposedly vegetative state might be partly aware. And obviously this has raised questions about how we categorize these patients. They're not vegetative, they're not minimally conscious, and conflating the two is slowing progress. So that's one of the debates that's still raging. So for the article, I was also, apart from being blown away by the work of Stephen Lorries and Adrian Owen, we've got Nico Schiff here, who was a disciple of Fred Plum's school. Now what he has done is he's done work on the awareness network of the brain. You can imagine your brain's got limited data processing abilities. On the African savannah, we had to focus on that approaching spear or that lion lurking in the undergrowth and not be fazed by, you know, the epic vision of the savannah and so on. So you can think of it as a spotlight of attention. And they were interested in the neural circuitry, really building on pioneering experiments on cats in the 40s that showed that a structure deep in the brain called the thalamus played a central role. Now, a key population of nerve cells radiate from the thalamus to the rind of the brain, has a central role in waking up. They've got a central role in coma too, because they're more vulnerable than other brain cells or nerve cells to things like oxygen starvation, which explains why brain damage can render you unconscious. And basically, Nico Schiff in particular has talked about the Mesa Circuit, which consists of a couple of circuits linking the thalamus to the cortex. Some of the connections are boosting nerve activity and others reduce or prevent it. You can think of a kind of a dynamic coalition of these brain networks. So here's Nico's image, and this is really the part where I'm going to at last talk about the future of medicine. What's fascinating about the Mesa Circuit is it's given insights from some very puzzling observations of how to jumpstart a stalled brain. So in 95, Schiff had an 81-year-old woman who'd had a stroke, and she suffered neglect. She couldn't identify her right hand, and there's a standard test you do where you squirt ice-cold water into their ear just to see how lopsided her responses were. And to his amazement, the woman cried out, "That's my hand." She rediscovered her missing hand. And that chill somehow activated her thalamus, which got that Mesa Circuit network going again and knitted together the networks that had been disrupted by the stroke. As soon as the water in her ear warmed up, she lost her hand again. So he's used the Mesa Circuit to explain apparently paradoxical discovery that a sedative, zolpidem, can awake some patients in a vegetative state. And there are other effects caused by amantadine, an anti-Parkinson's drug. And it's given us even more dramatic insights into how to jumpstart a brain. So Nico Schiff in 2005 tried out an implant on a man who'd been beaten and left minimally conscious. And they implanted a brain pacemaker, stimulated the thalamus, and it roused him enough to respond to requests. He could eat, he could drink. Normally he could carry out simple tasks. Stephen Lorries has taken a different approach. He's used transcranial direct current stimulation. Again, 55 people who are minimally conscious or vegetative state, where electrodes were used to put a weak direct current through the scalp and to the skull. You had 15 who showed glimmers of consciousness as a result. 2 of them who'd been declared minimally conscious were actually able to nod and move their eyes in response to questions. So I don't want to oversell this, because you can, if you saw the scans of some of these patients and the brain damage, it's hard to see how they're ever going to have a normal life. But it obviously could be of huge significance for a subset of those patients. So that's really my narrative about narratives. I mean, I really want to thank the people at Mosaic, Giles, Mark and Monk Keat, for giving me the opportunity to tell me of these stories, which are kind of thought-provoking in every way. I want to thank the family of Jamel Brell for talking about their struggle to reconnect with him. And Adrian, Nico and Stephen are still doing lots of work on disorders of consciousness, but also on those normal facets of consciousness that are so neglected: daydreaming, sleep, anesthesia. And who knows, one day we might even be able to answer that deceptively simple question: what is consciousness? Thank you very much.